So the variation shader is creating colors across all my individual clones now, so that's working, but it's looking very flat, and I want to create something that's really bright and shiny, a really sort of glossy, reflective surface. So I need to add some highlights and reflections to my material. So let's double click the material that I've got set up, and what I want to use is this Reflectance Channel, and this is where we can create reflections and shiny highlights on any kind of material. So if I turn this on, what we get straight away is what's called a default specular highlight, which is just a bright shiny highlight. We've got a preview of the highlight here and sort of a graph view of what this highlight looks like. Now I want something that's really glossy and super sharp and shiny. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the width of my highlight down so it's narrower. And I'm also going to make it much stronger. So this specular strength, I'm going to turn this right up to almost full. So we're getting this sharper, bright highlight on the surface of our material. So what I can do now is hit Shift-R on my keyboard to do a test render. And what I should see shortly is some small highlights on the surface of the clones. And if I just click between my two renders here, the previous one with no highlights, and the one I've just done, I can just see, especially in this area here, there's a little cluster of shiny highlights. So I've got a little bit of brightness on there. So that's a good start. The other thing I want to do is add some reflection. So again, in this Reflectance channel, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new layer into this channel. So if I click Add, I'm going to use this layer. It's called a GGX layer. And what it does is it creates a mirrored surface. Now we can see straight away in our preview swatch that our material's reflective looking. It looks like sort of shiny chrome. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to double click the layer name here and just call this Reflections. It's always a good idea to name everything that you create. Now these layers that we're creating inside this Reflectance channel, these stack on top of each other like Photoshop layers. What I want to do is I want to have my reflection layer and then on top of that a bright shiny highlight. So I'm going to click and drag my specular layer on top of my reflections. I'm just going to do another test render here and see what this looks like. So again, hit Shift-R. Of course, the good thing is by hitting Shift-R and using the picture viewer, we can click through previous renders and we can compare these as we go. And one thing we can see straight away with this render is that we've lost all the color and we've got this pure mirrored type surface, and we're just getting the grey ground and the black sky mirrored in it. So it's reflecting, which is great, but it's overridden all of our color. So in exactly the same way that in Photoshop we can mask layers, we can do the same thing in our Reflectance channel. So our reflections are dominating the surface at the moment. I want to mask them. So I'm going to select this reflections layer. I'm going to come down and I've got a layer mask section in my material options. What I'm going to do is I'm going to load a texture into the layer mask, and it's going to be a Fresnel texture. Now we've used this in previous exercises, and what it does is it uses a black and white gradient that it spreads across the surface of 3D objects so that the black area is facing towards us and the white area sort of wraps around the edges of any 3D object. So for this mask, what it means is the reflection on our surface in the center here is masked, but around the edges we still get this reflection, and we can see that previewed in our material swatch. I can see my color, but now there's a reflected mirror around the edges. So again, let's hit Shift-R to test render that. And the other thing we need to do here is just keep an eye on our render times. You can see here, as we add in reflections, we've gone from about 6 seconds to render that frame to 19 seconds. This is sped up a little bit, it's got a little bit less reflection in it. But keep an eye on this because obviously rendering is always a balance between the quality or the detail that you want and how long it takes to render. So we don't want our renders getting too long. So if we just compare these images now, so we've got some shiny highlights, there's a little bit of reflection, and that's got the color back this time now that we've masked out some of the reflections. What I'm going to do is zoom in much closer to my clones here and do another test render so I get a much better idea of what the reflections are doing. So I'm just going to zoom in here and get a little closer, and you can actually see in the window we've actually got reflections previewing on our surfaces. We don't get the entire material, but we've got some parts of the material are previewing here. Anyway, we're a little bit closer, so I'm just going to hit Shift-R again, and we'll get a closer look at what's happening with our reflections in our clones, and now I can really see we're really getting this nice shiny glossy look. I can see these little dots of highlights. I can also see these reflections, so that's really starting to look pretty good. Now I want to put a little bit more lighting into my scene, and I'm just going to do the super easy thing in Cinema, and that's to add a physical sky to my scene. So let's go to Create menu, add a physical sky. Now what this will do is create a lighting system through the whole scene. It'll add shadows, and obviously it's going to put a lot more light in here. So I'm expecting that this is going to get brighter and even more shiny. So once again, Shift R, test render. And now we can see we're definitely getting a lot brighter in our reflections. We're really starting to get it to pop. And that's because the reflections are now reflecting the physical sky as well. So we're getting all those color tones from the background, the sky, this gradient of color from the horizon up to the sky. That's all starting to appear in the reflections. I can see this render's getting a lot slower now. We're already up to nearly 40 seconds, and it's probably only about halfway through. So definitely it's affecting our render times. So this is looking really good. I like it a lot better. We're really getting that brightness in there. The only problem now is this is actually getting a little too bright. I can see I've got some shadows down here, so that's a good start. But it's really starting to sort of blow out some of the detail in all these individual clones. They're starting to get a little bit overlit and a little bit flat looking. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new rendering technique. And what it does is it creates really subtle shadowing in between objects that are close together. So this technique is called Ambient Occlusion. It's really easy to set up, and it's really good for creating a much higher level of detail in your lighting. And we do that in our render settings. So render settings are up here, the clapperboard with a cog on it, or Command B. And what I'm going to do is go to my Effects menu in the renderer, and I'm going to add Ambient Occlusion. Now, as with everything, it's got a whole bunch of settings. I'm just going to leave it on the default settings. So what Ambient Occlusion is, it is occluding or blocking ambient light. So what it means is where we get objects that are close together, what we should see in real life is we get little tiny shadows and shaded areas sort of pooling in between objects close together as they're close together and they're blocking any ambient light from sort of bouncing around. And that's exactly what it means. So let me just hit Shift R again, and I'm going to close my render settings. Now that last render I did was 1:16, so we're definitely starting to slow down now. And the ambient occlusion is fairly quick to render. It doesn't add too much to your render times, so it's a pretty good option. Now let's have a look. If I just switch between the two of these, even as it's rendering, I can do this. And if we have a look at this cluster of clones here, as I switch backwards and forwards, we can just see there's really nice little dark shaded areas in the middle. It's adding a lot more contrast and a lot more lighting detail. So what I've got from the physical sky and the reflections is the brightness, and what the ambient occlusion is giving me is the contrast, the range of lighting, and it's a very natural lighting type effect, and it's one that I would highly recommend using for almost any style of rendering. I'm going to pause recording here, and I will render a full resolution close-up of this at the end of this video so you can compare. So this is looking really good. If I could compare it with the previous render, so we're just getting all the subtle shadowing in the in between the clones, and it looks far more realistic. My render time was just over 2 minutes, so as I mentioned earlier, we need to be really careful of our render times, but this is looking great.